On a cold October evening in the town of Milton, a young woman pulls her car into the parking lot near her apartment. She throws her bag over her shoulder and heads towards her building. But someone's waiting for her. And what happened that night would expose a mess of lies, jealousy, and secrets. Welcome to the Smoking Sun. If you're into true crime and sometimes creepy stories that are stranger than fiction, make sure to hit the subscribe button, because those are the kind of stories that I tell. Now, let's get into it. Lila was 28 and worked mornings at the Corner Brew Cafe, a little shop on Hawthorne Drive in Milton. People would come for more than just coffee. Neighbors stopped to catch up, students spread out their laptops, and regulars traded stories over second cups. And what kept them coming back was the way that Lila made the place feel. She wasn't loud and flashy, but she did have a way of making people feel important. She remembered orders, cracked a quick joke when the espresso machine sputtered, and almost always sent customers out the door smiling. She lived with her cat Jasper in a small apartment above a nearby bookstore. The place was small and had low ceilings, but it suited her just fine. From there, her life followed a steady rhythm. The morning rush at the cafe, afternoons running errands, and weekends meeting friends at the Stopover, a quiet neighborhood bar where her and her friends could relax. And when she wanted quiet, she would hike a path just outside of town. On slow days, she doodled little sketches, usually of foxes, faces, or trees, and leave them on the table for customers to find. Now, Lila grew up in Milton with her mom Diane, who worked long shifts as a nurse at the county hospital. When her father left when she was 7, Diane carried everything on her own: the bills, the school forms, and the late-night worries. But she still managed to keep the house warm and the laughter real. And even after Lila moved out, they kept their rituals. They texted about nothing and everything, shared pizza on Diane's rare nights off, and spent most Saturdays at the farmer's market picking up bread, vegetables, and jars of jam that they really didn't need, but ended up buying anyway, as if it was part of a tradition. In the fall of 2018, Lila had settled into a routine, and she was feeling optimistic about what lied ahead. She talked about opening her own restaurant, one with big windows, soft chairs, and a corner for live music. And it wasn't just daydreaming. She actually kept a small notebook where she wrote down menu items, color schemes, and jotted down songs she thought would fit. Something livelier in the mornings and something softer in the evenings. With every page, the ideas looked less like a wish and more like a plan. Now, around that time, she was seeing a guy named Ethan. He was 30 years old and had moved to Milton from a nearby city. He was a mechanic with grease-stained hands that would coax an engine back to life, and his crooked grin kind of made him seem easygoing. Sometimes he'd even show up at Lila's with roadside flowers just because he thought of her. To Lila, it felt like the kind of attention she deserved, and for a while, it was easy to believe it was genuine. But Sarah, Lila's best friend and co-worker, felt there were sides of him that just didn't sit right with her. She thought Ethan looked through Lila's phone way too often when she stepped into the back, and she didn't like how he'd show up at Lila's place without asking, just saying that he missed her. Lila would just shrug it off and tell Sarah that he meant well, but Sarah noticed her smile disappear at times whenever his name showed up on the screen. To her, there was something in the way that Lila said, "It's fine," that made it seem like it really wasn't. On one slow afternoon, Sarah overheard Lila on the phone with Ethan. Her voice was sharper than usual as she told him that he needed to back off and give her some room. Then she put her phone away and went right back to steaming milk as if nothing happened. Sarah didn't say anything. She felt that sometimes friends needed space more than they needed questions. But she didn't forget it either, because the tone of Lila's voice stuck with her. On the night of October 12, 2018, Lila was working the evening shift instead of her usual morning one and finished up around 7. The place was still busy with office workers grabbing coffee and teenagers hanging around the booths while the door kept dinging every few minutes. She and Sarah were wiping down counters and talked about the weekend. Maybe go to the Stopover with friends, maybe a movie if something decent was playing, or maybe a hike in the morning if the weather was right. As she left, Lila put on her jacket, waved goodbye to Sarah, and headed out. At 7:15, she would send a text to her mother that said, "I'm heading home, love you." She drove to the post office parking lot next to the bookstore, parked her car, grabbed her bag, and headed towards her door. But in the parking lot was a familiar face, waiting for her to arrive. By 10 o'clock, Diane had a feeling something was wrong. Lila always called when she got home. It wasn't just a routine, it was more of a promise, and a habit that meant everything was okay. She tried calling Lila, but her phones went to voicemail, and her texts went unanswered. Diane then phoned Sarah, but she didn't know anything. Then she called Ethan, but he said he hadn't seen Lila since the night before. By midnight, with nowhere else to turn, she walked into the Milton Police Department, her hand shaking as she gave the desk officer, Officer Tate, her daughter's information. Now, Tate suggested that maybe Lila was out with her friends and her phone died, but Diane shook her head and told him that wasn't anything like her daughter. Besides, her last text said she was heading home. Detective Mark overheard the exchange. He was 42 years old and known for being sharp-eyed. He spent his whole life in Milton and became an officer to protect the city he loved. He'd known Diane for years and remembered Lila as the girl who was always carrying a book. He brought Diane into a small interview room and asked her for everything she could tell him. When Lila was last seen, the routes she usually walked, and the people she might have called if she felt unsafe. He didn't promise her anything. He just told her that they were going to start looking, and they had enough information to get started. Now, there's a common myth that police won't act on an adult unless they've been missing for 24 hours. But in reality, detectives know that those first 24 to 48 hours are the most critical. And Mark wasn't about to lose that time. So by 1 a.m., Mark was at the post office parking lot and he saw Lila's car. He checked the driver's door. It was locked. There was no broken glass. There was no sign of struggle. And there was no obvious answer. Just that her car was still there and Lila wasn't. He also noticed the lights in the parking lot. They didn't cover everywhere. There were dark gaps in between the lights. The nearby cameras didn't offer much. The post office camera only pointed to the lobby, not the lot. The dry cleaner system shut off at 6, and the hardware store's camera was angled towards the sidewalk, catching nothing but people walking by. Now, there was a bank camera down the block that had the clearest view of the lot, but that footage required a warrant, and Mark knew that would take some time. So he kept checking and hoping for an angle he'd missed, but nothing gave him what he needed. The only solid lead came from Lila's phone, which pinged off a tower at 7:16 that night. But after that, it went silent. And for investigators, silence like that means the trail is already starting to cool. Back at the station, Mark asked Sarah to come in since she closed with Lila that night and was the last known person to see her. He started the interview with the usual questions: what time Lila left, how she seemed that day, and whether anything felt out of the ordinary. Once those questions were out of the way, Sarah brought up Ethan. She explained that she felt that he could be controlling. She'd seen him check Lila's phone when she wasn't looking, and she didn't care for how he'd sometimes show up at Lila's apartment without being asked. Then she mentioned a customer. His name was Tom. She said maybe it was nothing, but he always seemed to show up when Lila was working, order a single coffee, and stay far longer than anyone else. He seemed to watch Lila more than he drank, sometimes scribbling in a worn notebook and making small talk that never felt entirely casual, asking Lila what kind of books she liked, whether she'd been out hiking lately, or if the markets were still busy on Saturdays. She admitted that none of that was illegal, but the way he lingered gave her this weird feeling she couldn't shake. Mark also spoke with Ellen, a retiree who lived across the street from Lila's building. Since her front window faced the lot, she was in a good spot to notice things. She told him around 7:30 she saw a tall man in a dark jacket standing near the cars. She didn't see his face, but at the time, she didn't think much of it. She figured he was waiting for a ride or something. People did that all the time, and it didn't stand out to her as unusual. By morning, Mark had officers canvassing the city. He checked the creek bed, park, the alleyways, and the trails on the edge of town. Nothing turned up. And that kind of nothing, after covering so much ground, sat heavy with Mark, because every lead he followed seemed to end the same way. Mark then brought Ethan in for questioning. Ethan told Mark that he'd been at the stopover until 9 playing pool, and he was adamant that he hadn't seen Lila that night. Then, almost in the same breath, he added that Mark should check on Tom, because a few nights earlier he had seen him hanging around Lila's car. It was useful information, but at the same time it also seemed too convenient. Mark wrote it down word for word, and then asked Ethan for the names of the guys he played pool with. From there, he went to the bar and pulled the camera footage. Although cameras are annoying, sometimes they're everything. With both Sarah and Ethan pointing to Tom, Mark knew he had to sit down with him next. Tom told him that after leaving the cafe, he went straight home, microwaved some dinner, and watched TV by himself. He admitted that he sometimes cut through the post office parking lot because it was quicker, but he denied ever seeing Lila that night. Then Mark brought up his notebook, and he asked him what he was always writing in it. And Tom just said, ideas, as if that one word was supposed to be enough to move on. Mark noticed his hands were shaking, but nerves can mean a lot of things, and Mark knew better than let one tremor do all the talking. Within days, missing person posters with Lila's face were taped to telephone poles and shop windows. As the days stretched into weeks, those posters started to curl at the corners and sag in the rain. Diane would notice them whenever she drove across town and walked to the store, each one a reminder that nothing has changed. The case was still in the news, still in people's conversation, but not in the way that brought her any comfort. The questions didn't go away, they just got tougher with time. Mark kept thinking about the people connected to the cafe, and one of them was Greg. He owned the place before selling it a year prior, and that week he happened to be in town visiting his sister. Sarah mentioned how he sometimes stood too close to Lila, once even touching her arm in a way that made her step back. When Mark questioned him, Greg said he hadn't seen Lila, and his sister backed him up, saying Greg had been at dinner. And a neighbor would also say they remembered his car in the driveway. The bartender working that evening at the stopover later told Mark that Ethan left closer to 7:45, more than 1 hour before Ethan said he did, and the cameras had backed it up, showing him leaving right around 7:45 that night. When Mark confronted Ethan, he just said that he had gone for a drive and nothing more than that, but he didn't exactly say where he went. Soon after this, Ethan got a lawyer, and there wasn't much more that Mark could get out of him. While Ethan's story didn't add up, he wasn't the only person on Mark's mind. Tom's name kept coming up. He stayed jittery, repeating his routine: coffee, home, microwave dinner, and watching TV. Now, he had no alibi, but without a car, it was hard to picture him taking Lila anywhere. But the lack of that alibi still kept him on the board. In July of the following year, a hiker on a narrow trail around 10 miles outside of Milton noticed a blue shoe caught in some old tree roots by a creek. He took a photo, noted the spot on his phone, and called 911. He stayed right there waiting, making sure nothing was disturbed. Diane would later confirm that the shoe was Lila's. She knew Lila's shoe, the brand, the color, and even a worn spot on the tongue. This wasn't good news, and she was devastated. Searchers set up a grid and moved through the area slowly. Around 100 yards downstream, behind some old willow trees, they found a slope with the soil that looked different from the surrounding area. When they tested the ground, it gave way. They cleared it back, and the storms had already started to uncover what was there. and that's when they found Lila's body. From the decomposed state and the condition of her clothes, the coroner was confident that she had been strangled the night that she disappeared. The words were clinical, but they were crushing to hear. Nearby, a scrap of dark jacket fabric was caught on a branch where the path veered off out of eyesight. It was heavy enough to be outerwear, torn along the seam. Mark sent it to the lab, and when he told Diane and Sarah about what they found, he didn't try to soften it. There weren't any words that could. He just made sure Diane had a chair, a glass of water, and someone to drive her home. Then he went back to the station and started combing through the case from the top again. While the DNA was still at the lab, Mark reopened everything with a creek in mind. Ethan's phone had gone quiet for roughly 2 hours that night before pinging south of town. It didn't look good, but it wasn't enough. Tom's version hadn't changed. His hands still shook, but nothing placed him with Lila after 7:15. Greg's alibi looked fine on paper, but when Mark pressed the neighbor who claimed to have seen his vehicle, the answer shifted to just evening. But was that enough? When the lab finally called, the DNA on the fabric gave Mark his answer. He finally knew who had murdered Lila. He didn't waste a moment. He called the prosecutor, got the warrant, and brought along 2 officers he trusted, ones who let him lead the investigation while they listened closely. Then he drove to the suspect's place and knocked on the door. The killer opened the door. He offered them water, sat down with their hands together, and wouldn't take his eyes off of Mark. Mark told him, "We found Lila, and we found your jacket." He let those words hang in the air, giving him time to sink in. The killer denied it at first, then tried to explain it away. The story shifted, but then finally, the killer admitted he had been obsessed with her. He said he had waited for her car that night. When she told him to leave her alone, the killer insisted they talk. Then he drove her to the creek, and that's when she tried to get out. The killer panicked and then snapped. The spot the killer described matched exactly where the searchers found Lila's body. Mark didn't need to hear anything else. He knew the confession was real, and he arrested the killer, and finally, the case had answers. The killer was Greg, the cafe's former owner. For months, he had stayed in the background of the investigation, his name showing up but never sticking. When the DNA came back, there was no hiding anymore. He admitted he couldn't let go of Lila. He built up an obsession, telling himself that she owed him for her time because of old connections at the cafe. That night, when she told him to leave her alone, he snapped. What he called just wanting to talk turned into violence he couldn't take back. In 2020, Greg would eventually be convicted of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. The story is based on true events, and out of respect for people who are not responsible for what happened, and to protect those living with its impact, names and some of the details have changed. The crime, the investigation, and the outcome remain exactly as they happened. If you enjoyed this story, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to The Smoking Sun for more stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and as always, see you next time.